Imagine a peaceful summer day, where a 9-year-old girl named Lily is happily drawing with colorful chalk on the sidewalk in front of her home. But in the blink of an eye, her innocent artwork turns into the center of a heartbreaking confrontation when an officer arrests her, accusing her of vandalizing public property. What starts as a misunderstanding spirals into a powerful fight for justice as Lily's father, Samuel, who also happens to be the town's mayor, takes on the entire police department, demanding accountability and change. As you follow this family's emotional journey, you'll witness moments of heartbreak, hope, and triumph. How far will Samuel go to protect his daughter? And can a small town, divided by fear and authority, come together to rebuild trust? This is a story about courage, family, and the strength it takes to stand up for what's right, no matter the odds. Will justice prevail? You'll have to watch to find out. Don't forget to comment below with your thoughts as the story unfolds, and if you're ready for more compelling stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's dive into Chalk Lines. It was a bright, lazy afternoon in the quiet suburbs of Bloomfield, Ohio. The sun cast a golden glow over the tree-lined streets, with cicadas humming softly in the distance. The summer break had just begun, and the neighborhood was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the occasional bark of a dog, and the distant hum of lawnmowers. Lily Carter, 9 years old and brimming with creativity, sat in front of her house, her chalk-stained hands busy at work. She had been at it for hours, creating an entire world on the pavement. Flowers, birds, a smiling sun, and a rainbow that arched across the street. It was a masterpiece in her eyes. She smiled with satisfaction, wiping the sweat from her brow as she bent down to add one more touch. Her favorite, a butterfly with shimmering blue wings. Her parents, Samuel and Tara Carter, had always encouraged Lily's artistic spirit. They'd told her that drawing on the sidewalk was fine as long as she stayed close to home. After all, what harm could a little chalk do? Samuel, the town's mayor, watched from the front window, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Despite his busy schedule, he made time to see these moments, the ones where his daughter's joy was most evident. Being mayor had its pressures, but nothing compared to the peace he found in his family. Lily was lost in her colorful world, completely unaware of the squad car pulling up at the corner of the street. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the calm, but it wasn't until the heavy boots of Officer Brent Simmons hit the pavement that she looked up. The shadow that fell over her sent a chill through the warm air. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" A voice, sharp and cold, broke through Lily's concentration. Startled, Lily dropped the pink chalk she had been using to outline a heart. She turned around and found herself face to face with Officer Simmons. He was tall, with a rigid posture and a stern expression that never seemed to soften. He had a reputation in town, a cop who believed in strict order, no matter how small the infraction. "Hi, officer," Lily said quietly, standing up. Her heart thumped in her chest. "I'm just drawing." Simmons crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at the chalk art sprawling across the pavement. To anyone else it would have looked like innocent fun, but to him it was an eyesore, a violation of order. "This isn't your property," he barked. "You can't be marking up public spaces. That's called vandalism." Lily blinked, her hands starting to tremble. "Vandalism?" she repeated, barely understanding the word. "But it's just chalk. It washes away with rain." Simmons took a step closer, his looming presence casting a longer shadow. "That's not the point. You're defacing public property, and there are rules about that. You can't just do whatever you want." Lily's eyes began to well up with tears. She looked around helplessly, hoping someone, anyone, would come to her defense. "I didn't know. My dad said it was okay." Simmons wasn't listening. His mind was made up. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his voice cold and final. Lily took a step back, her tears spilling over. "No, please," she cried. "I'll clean it up. My dad's inside, you can talk to him." But Simmons ignored her. In one swift motion, he grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight and unyielding. Lily struggled, her small frame no match for his strength. "Please," she sobbed, trying to twist away. "I didn't do anything wrong." Simmons reached for the handcuffs at his belt, his expression void of sympathy. With a chilling click, the cold metal closed around Lily's tiny wrists. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as fear gripped her. Across the street, a door creaked open. Carol Davenport stepped out onto her porch, her eyes narrowing in on the scene unfolding before her. She had lived in the neighborhood for years, always keeping a close eye on her surroundings. And lately, she'd grown increasingly annoyed by the Carter family. Carol stood with her arms crossed, watching as Officer Simmons dragged Lily toward the squad car. A satisfied smirk tugged at her lips. Finally, someone was doing something about the mess in the neighborhood. She had called the police after seeing Lily drawing earlier, convinced that it was time someone handled the disruptive behavior. "I'm glad someone's taking care of this," Carol called out, her voice loud and pointed. She glanced at Lily, her face full of disapproval. "She's been marking up the street for days." Lily's heart sank even further. She looked back at Carol, pleading with her tear-filled eyes. "I was just drawing." Carol waved her hand dismissively. "This isn't a playground," she said sharply. "You can't just let kids mark up the street. It brings down the whole neighborhood." Officer Simmons seemed to take this as validation. Without another word, he opened the door of his squad car and shoved Lily inside. The door slammed shut, sealing her inside the cold metal cage. Lily pressed her tear-streaked face against the window, her bright chalk drawings fading from view as Simmons got into the driver's seat. The flowers, the birds, the big, smiling sun, they were all left behind, along with her sense of safety. Inside the house, Samuel Carter was on the phone, discussing an upcoming town meeting, when he heard the faint cry of his daughter's voice. He froze, his breath catching in his chest. Something was wrong. Tara, who had been in the kitchen, noticed the change in her husband's expression. "Samuel? What is it?" Without answering, Samuel rushed to the front door, flinging it open. His heart stopped when he saw the squad car pulling away from the curb. Lily in the back seat, her tear-filled face pressed against the glass. "Hey!" Samuel shouted, racing toward the car. "Stop!" But it was too late. The car had already turned the corner, disappearing down the street. For a moment, Samuel stood frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. His daughter, his little girl, had been taken away in handcuffs. Tara rushed out after him, panic etched across her face. "Samuel, what happened? Where's Lily?" They took her," Samuel said, his voice barely a whisper. "The police. They arrested her." Tara's eyes widened in horror. "What? For what?" "I don't know," Samuel shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know." Without another word, Samuel ran to his car, Tara close behind. His hands shook as he fumbled for the keys. His mind raced, filled with images of Lily, his sweet, innocent daughter, sitting in a cold, dark cell. As they sped toward the police station, Samuel gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Tara sat beside him, her hands trembling in her lap. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for the fear that gripped their hearts. When they arrived at the police station, Samuel burst through the doors, his chest heaving with panic. Behind the front desk, Officer Simmons stood, arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference. "Where's my daughter?" Samuel demanded, his voice booming through the small station. Simmons didn't flinch. "She's being processed," he said coolly, "for vandalizing public property." Samuel's blood boiled. "Vandalism?" "She was drawing with chalk." "Public property," Simmons repeated as though that explained everything. Tara stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please," she begged. "She's just a child. Let her go." But Simmons remained unmoved. "There are rules, and she broke them. We follow procedures here." Just as the tension reached its peak, a door at the back of the station swung open. Chief Diane Palmer stepped out, her expression grim. She had heard the commotion and knew immediately what had happened. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Let's step into my office. We can sort this out." Samuel's fists clenched, but he nodded. The anger simmering inside him wasn't going to fade easily. But for now, his focus was on one thing: getting his daughter back. Chief Diane Palmer's office was small, cluttered with files, and lacked the authority of her position. It was clear she hadn't expected to be dealing with such an incident today. She gestured for Samuel and Tara to sit, but Samuel refused. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his voice tight with anger. "I want my daughter released. Now," Samuel demanded, his voice calm but dangerously controlled. Diane sighed, glancing at Officer Simmons, who stood just outside the door, arms still folded in arrogant defiance. It was clear that Diane was caught between protocol and the increasing heat from a powerful figure like Samuel Carter, the town's mayor. "Mr. Carter, I understand your frustration, but we have procedures to follow when a report is made," Diane began, her voice even. She had been doing this job long enough to know how delicate the situation had become, especially with the Carters involved. "We need to process Lily's information, but I can assure you, we'll handle this carefully." "You've arrested a 9-year-old for drawing on the sidewalk," Samuel interrupted, his voice rising. "Chalk! My daughter was drawing with chalk. What possible reason could there be for putting her in handcuffs?" Tara, sitting beside him, reached out to place a calming hand on Samuel's arm, but he pulled away, still fuming. She understood his rage, she felt it too, but she knew they needed to tread carefully. Diane folded her hands on the desk, leaning forward slightly. "Mr. Carter, Officer Simmons was acting on a call from a resident," she explained. "He followed protocol, but I can assure you we are going to handle this as delicately as possible." "Delicately?" Samuel repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You think handcuffing a terrified child is delicate?" Before Diane could respond, the door to the holding area opened. A second officer, Officer Emily Hayes, stepped into the room, holding Lily gently by the hand. Lily's face was tear-streaked, her eyes wide with fear. The handcuffs had been removed, but the marks they left on her small wrists were still visible, faint impressions on her skin. Tara gasped, immediately rising from her seat and rushing to her daughter's side. She enveloped Lily in her arms, her eyes welling up with tears. "Oh, baby, are you okay?" Lily nodded weakly but clung to her mother like a lifeline. Her small body trembled as she whispered, "I didn't mean to do anything wrong, Mommy." Samuel's rage shifted to anguish as he looked at his daughter. He bent down beside Tara, pulling them both into his embrace. For a moment the room was silent except for the soft sounds of Lily's sobs. Diane watched the scene unfold, guilt weighing heavily on her shoulders. She knew this situation should have never escalated to this point, but the damage was done. By the next morning, news of the incident had spread throughout Bloomfield. It started with whispers at the local diner, grew to a conversation at the grocery store, and by the end of the day, the entire town knew that Mayor Carter's daughter had been arrested for drawing with chalk. Samuel didn't want the situation to become a media circus, but he knew that keeping it under wraps was impossible. The community had rallied behind his family. People were outraged, not just because Lily was the mayor's daughter, but because the incident highlighted the growing divide between law enforcement and the residents. The following evening, a community meeting was called at the town hall. It was standing room only. Samuel stood at the front, facing a crowd of neighbors, teachers, parents, and local business owners. He had prepared to address the crowd calmly, to explain what happened and lay out his plan for ensuring it never happened again. But as he scanned the room, seeing the looks of anger and disbelief on their faces, he felt the emotional weight of the situation pressing down on him. "This could have been any one of our children," Samuel began, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "This wasn't just an issue with Lily, my daughter. It's an issue with how we're being treated by the people sworn to protect us." The room murmured in agreement. Tara sat in the front row, Lily on her lap, her head resting on her mother's chest. Tara gently stroked her daughter's hair, trying to comfort her in the only way she could. "There is no justification," Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger, "for handcuffing a child over chalk drawings. This isn't about vandalism. This is about control, and it's about power being misused. And I'm here to tell you, as both a father and your mayor, that I'm not going to stand for it." The crowd erupted in applause. Samuel felt the fire inside him grow. He was determined to channel his anger into action. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. and he wouldn't let Officer Simmons or anyone else get away with treating his daughter, or anyone's child, like a criminal. As the meeting continued, other families began to speak up, sharing their own experiences with Officer Simmons. Parents told stories of their children being stopped for no reason, harassed on their way home from school, and intimidated for playing too loudly in the park. One mother, Angela Lewis, stood up, her voice shaky but strong. "My son was stopped last week for riding his bike too fast down our street," she said. "He's 10 years old." Officer Simmons told him if he didn't slow down, he'd arrest him for reckless behavior. A 10-year-old! The room buzzed with outrage, and Samuel knew that the problem ran deeper than he had realized. This wasn't just about Lily. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to go unchecked for far too long. The morning after the meeting, Samuel sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. He had been on the phone with lawyers all night, seeking advice on how to proceed. Tara sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her eyes tired from sleepless nights. "We have to do something," Tara said quietly, her voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. "We can't let this go." Samuel nodded, his fingers tapping against the keyboard. "I've been talking to a few civil rights lawyers. They think we have a strong case for a civil suit against the department." Tara looked down at her coffee, her brow furrowed in concern. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Samuel sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know. But we can't sit by and do nothing. If this happened to Lily, it'll happen to someone else. Maybe it already has." He glanced toward the living room where Lily sat quietly, coloring with markers in her notebook. Since the incident, she had avoided going outside. Her chalk lay untouched by the front door, and Samuel's heart broke a little more each time he saw it. "I just want her to feel safe again," Tara whispered, her voice trembling. "I want her to be happy." Samuel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We'll get there," he promised, though he wasn't sure how. "But it's going to take time." Across town, Officer Brent Simmons sat in Chief Palmer's office, his arms crossed, his face set in a defiant scowl. Chief Palmer stood behind her desk, her gaze hard as she addressed the officer in front of her. "I don't know if you've been paying attention, Simmons, but this situation has blown up," Chief Palmer said, her voice edged with frustration. "People are angry. The mayor's leading a movement, and the entire department is under scrutiny." Simmons shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched. "I was just doing my job," he muttered. "She was defacing public property. That's against the law." Chief Palmer shook her head, incredulous. "She's a child. A 9-year-old girl drawing with chalk. You don't handcuff a kid over something like that." "It's still public property," Simmons insisted, his voice growing louder. "I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Chief Palmer repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "You think that excuses what you did?" Simmons stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think I'm the bad guy here? I'm the one trying to keep this town in order. The rules apply to everyone, no exceptions. Not even the mayor's daughter." Chief Palmer's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about rules, Simmons. This is about how you treat people, how you treat children. And right now, the way you handled this situation is making us all look bad." Simmons scoffed, shaking his head as he turned to leave. "I did my job. If people don't like it, that's not my problem." As the door slammed shut behind him, Chief Palmer sank into her chair, rubbing her temples. This wasn't going away anytime soon, and she knew it. The department had to act, and soon, or they'd risk losing the trust of the very community they were supposed to protect. Later that week, Samuel received a call from Alicia Rhodes, a prominent civil rights lawyer based in Cleveland. Alicia had heard about the incident through a colleague and was eager to help. Her reputation for taking on high-profile cases involving law enforcement misconduct made her the perfect ally. "Mr. Carter," Alicia said, her voice clear and confident through the phone, "I believe we have a strong case. What happened to your daughter is a clear violation of her civil rights." Samuel, pacing in his office, felt a surge of relief. "I don't just want this to be about Lily," he said. "This is about holding the department accountable for their actions. I want reforms, I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I understand, Alicia replied, and we'll push for that. But first we need to file the lawsuit and get the ball rolling. Once we've got their attention, we can start talking about the bigger picture. Samuel sat down, his mind racing with possibilities. How soon can we start? I'll have the paperwork ready by the end of the week, Alicia promised. This is going to be a fight, but I believe we can win. As Samuel hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The legal battle ahead would be long and difficult, but with Alicia on their side, he knew they had a chance. Over the next few weeks, the town of Bloomfield became a battleground of emotions. Samuel Carter was fighting for his daughter's dignity and safety. But as more families came forward with their own stories of harassment and misconduct, it became clear this was about much more than one family. The lawsuit was filed with Alicia Rhodes leading the charge, and local news began picking up on the story. Samuel sat in his office late one evening, staring at the growing pile of reports from other families. The stories were eerily similar to his own. Children stopped for trivial reasons. Families feeling intimidated by Officer Simmons and others in the department. The lawsuit was gaining momentum, but Samuel knew they needed more than legal action. They needed the court of public opinion to pressure real change. Tara walked in quietly, a tired smile on her face. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the desk. "You've been at this for hours," she said softly. "You need to rest." Samuel shook his head. "I can't rest. Not until this is over. There's too much at stake." Tara reached out and took his hand. "I know, but you can't carry all of this on your own." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "How's Lily?" Samuel sighed, glancing toward the door where the faint sound of the television drifted through. "She's better, but she still won't go outside. She's afraid to go back to drawing." Tara bit her lip, her eyes welling with tears. "It breaks my heart. She used to love spending hours out there, just letting her imagination run wild." Samuel clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "That's what they took from her, and I won't stop until she feels safe again." The tension in the town was palpable, and it wasn't long before it boiled over. A few days later, a peaceful protest was organized by the local Parents and Teachers Association. They gathered at the town square, holding signs that read, "Justice for Lily," and "Protect our children." A crowd of over 100 people marched through the streets, their voices united in calling for accountability. Lily and Tara stood on the sidelines, watching the procession. Samuel had insisted they stay out of the main protest for safety reasons, but Lily could feel the energy of the crowd. It was the first time since her arrest that she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Officer Simmons, however, wasn't about to let the protest go unnoticed. He stood on the steps of the police station, arms crossed, his face a mask of disdain as he watched the crowd approach. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, stepping down from the stairs. As the protesters neared the station, Samuel caught sight of Simmons walking toward them, his posture aggressive. The crowd began to quiet as Simmons pushed his way to the front, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. "Disperse!" Simmons barked. "This is a public disturbance. You're blocking the street." Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between Simmons and the crowd. "We have the right to protest," he said firmly, his voice calm but resolute. Simmons' eyes narrowed. "You have the right to protest on the sidewalks. You don't have the right to disrupt the peace." A tense silence fell over the crowd. Parents and children stared at Simmons, their anger simmering just below the surface. But Samuel held his ground. "We're not here to disrupt the peace," he said slowly. "We're here because you've disrupted ours. This isn't about breaking the law. This is about protecting our children from people like you." The words hit Simmons like a blow, and for a moment his confident smirk faltered. But he quickly recovered, scoffing. "You think a little protest is going to change anything? Rules are rules. Your daughter broke them, and I enforced them." Before Samuel could respond, a voice from the back of the crowd shouted, "You can't scare us anymore." Another voice joined in. "We're not afraid of you." The crowd began to chant, their voices growing louder with each second. "Justice for Lily! Justice for our kids!" Simmons looked around, his jaw clenched, but he knew he was outnumbered. He turned on his heel and stormed back toward the police station. His retreat met with a wave of cheers from the protesters. Samuel watched him go, his heart racing. This was just the beginning. But he knew it wasn't the end. As news of the protest spread, local media outlets began covering the story in greater detail. Samuel found himself in front of cameras more often than he was in his office, speaking on behalf of his daughter and the larger issues the town was facing. The incident had sparked conversations about racial bias, policing in small towns, and the responsibility of law enforcement to protect, not intimidate, their communities. One evening, after a particularly heated interview with a local news station, Samuel returned home to find Tara sitting on the porch with Lily. They were drawing together, using colored pencils instead of chalk, but it was the closest Lily had come to creating art since the incident. "How did it go?" Tara asked quietly, looking up as Samuel approached. Samuel sat down beside her, running a hand through his hair. "It's exhausting. They keep asking the same questions, and I feel like I'm saying the same things over and over. But I have to keep going. We need to keep this momentum." Tara nodded, her eyes drifting to Lily, who was focused on her drawing. "She's starting to open up again," she said softly. "But it's slow." Samuel sighed, watching his daughter's small hands move across the paper. "I just want her to be okay." Tara reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. She's stronger than we think." It was a few days later, during a town meeting, that Lily finally found her voice again. Samuel had brought her along, thinking it would be good for her to see how much support they had from the community. But as the meeting progressed, something in Lily shifted. She was sitting quietly beside Tara when one of the organizers asked if anyone else wanted to share their story. For a moment, Lily hesitated. She felt her heart pounding in her chest. But as she looked around the room, at the faces of the people who had come out to support her, she realized this was her chance. She took a deep breath, her small hand gripping her mother's. "I want to say something," Lily whispered. Tara's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Okay, sweetheart. You can do this." Lily stood up, her legs trembling slightly as she made her way to the front of the room. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the small girl standing before them. Samuel watched her with a mixture of pride and fear, his heart in his throat. Lily took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she began to speak. "I was just drawing. I didn't know it was wrong. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she continued. "I was scared when they took me away. I didn't understand why. It was just chalk." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Tears streamed down Tara's face as she listened to her daughter's trembling words, and Samuel's heart ached as he watched her relive the trauma. "But I don't want to be scared anymore," Lily continued, her voice growing stronger. "I want to be able to draw again. I want to feel safe again." A soft murmur swept through the crowd, and then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they rose to their feet, applauding. Lily wiped her eyes, glancing back at her parents, who were beaming with pride. Samuel rushed to his daughter's side, pulling her into his arms. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, kissing the top of her head. "You were so brave." Lily buried her face in her father's chest, feeling a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. She had found her voice, and now she was ready to take her life back. With the town behind them and Lily's bravery sparking even more support, the lawsuit gained significant traction. Alicia Rhodes was relentless in her pursuit of justice, filing motion after motion and gathering evidence of other cases where Officer Simmons had overstepped his authority. The police department, under growing pressure from the public and the media, suspended Simmons pending investigation. Chief Palmer, who had tried to stay neutral throughout the process, was forced to confront the systemic issues within her department. Meetings were held, reforms were discussed, but Samuel knew that real change would only come when the department was held accountable. Alicia had organized a hearing, and the day finally arrived. Samuel and Tara sat in the courtroom, their hearts pounding as they listened to opening arguments. Alicia's voice was firm and steady as she laid out the case, detailing the trauma that Lily had endured and the larger pattern of behavior within the department. When it was time for Lily to take the stand, the room fell silent. She was nervous, her small hands trembling as she sat before the judge, but she held her head high. "Lily," Alicia said gently, "can you tell the court what happened that day?" Lily nodded, her voice quiet but clear as she recounted the events of her arrest. She spoke of her fear, her confusion, and how the experience had changed her. "I just want to be able to draw again," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I want to feel safe." The courtroom was filled with emotion, and by the time Lily finished her testimony, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The hearing stretched on for hours, but as the day drew to a close, the judge made a preliminary ruling. Officer Simmons would remain suspended pending further investigation, and the police department would be required to implement new policies regarding the treatment of minors. It wasn't the final victory Samuel had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. As they left the courtroom, Samuel wrapped his arm around Lily's shoulders, his heart swelling with pride. "We're going to win this," he whispered. "I promise." Lily smiled up at him, her eyes filled with hope. "I know, Daddy." The courtroom victory brought a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The ruling to keep Officer Simmons suspended was only a temporary win. Samuel knew that the fight for justice was far from over. The investigation into Simmons' conduct dragged on, and while the initial court ruling required reforms, Samuel realized that bureaucracy would slow the changes he so desperately wanted. Weeks turned into months, and progress seemed painfully slow. Samuel began to feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. Despite the lawsuit and the growing media attention, there was still no definitive word on whether Simmons would be permanently removed from the force. Tara sat with him one evening as they watched the local news report on another incident of police misconduct in a nearby town. She sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Do you think this will ever end?" Tara whispered. "It feels like we're pushing and pushing, but we're stuck in place." Samuel squeezed her hand. "It will end," he said, though the doubt in his voice was hard to ignore. "It has to." Tara looked down at her lap, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her shirt. "I just want things to go back to normal," she said quietly. "I want Lily to feel safe again." Samuel nodded, but deep down, he knew that nothing would be the same after this. The battle for justice had taken a toll on all of them, especially Lily. Though she had begun drawing again, she still avoided using chalk. The memory of her arrest lingered like a shadow, and Samuel knew it would take time for her to feel whole again. As the legal battle dragged on, Samuel found himself spending more time in meetings, interviews, and phone calls with Alicia, and less time at home. His job as mayor had also grown more demanding. He had to juggle the pressures of his office with the lawsuit and the media frenzy surrounding it. The strain on his marriage became more apparent. Tara, who had always been his rock, began to withdraw. She tried to hide it, but Samuel noticed the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she would retreat to their bedroom earlier each night. She was overwhelmed by the stress of the lawsuit and the emotional toll it had taken on their family. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Samuel came home to find Tara sitting on the front porch, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared out at the darkening sky. He sat down beside her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. "Tara," Samuel began gently, "I know this has been hard on you, on all of us." Tara didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost fragile. "I'm scared, Sam," she admitted. "I'm scared this is never going to end, that this fight is going to tear us apart." Samuel felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on the fight for justice that he hadn't fully realized how much it was affecting Tara. He reached out and took her hand, but she didn't squeeze back. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she whispered. "It's like every day is a battle and I'm tired." Samuel swallowed hard. He had promised Tara that they would get through this, that they would win, but now he wasn't so sure. The weight of the lawsuit, the media attention, the pressure from the community, it was all closing in on him, and he could feel it pulling them apart. Amid the strain, a small glimmer of hope arrived in the form of Alicia Rhodes. She called one afternoon with promising news. The judge had granted a motion to expedite the investigation into Simmons' conduct, meaning they might finally see some movement on his potential dismissal. Samuel sat at his desk, listening to Alicia's voice on the other end of the line. "This is a good sign, Sam," Alicia said, her tone upbeat. "It means the court is taking this seriously. They're not going to let this drag on forever." Samuel felt a flicker of relief. "That's good news," he said, though his voice was tired. "But what about the department? I want real reform, not just one officer fired." "We're working on that," Alicia assured him. "I've been in touch with the department's legal team, and they're starting to feel the pressure. This isn't just about Simmons anymore. It's about how they've been operating for years." Samuel nodded, though he couldn't shake the exhaustion that clung to him. "Thanks, Alicia. I appreciate everything you're doing." As he hung up the phone, Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. The news was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Despite the small victories in court, the emotional toll on Lily remained. She had become quieter over the months, spending more time alone in her room, drawing in her notebooks. She no longer spoke about the arrest, but Samuel could see the fear in her eyes whenever they passed a police car or saw an officer on the street. One afternoon, Samuel found her sitting on the porch, her sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing a picture of the sun, but the bright yellow orb she had once drawn with so much joy now seemed muted, as if the light had been dimmed. "Hey, sweetheart," Samuel said softly, sitting down beside her. "That's a beautiful sun." Lily didn't look up. "It doesn't feel right," she murmured, her voice small. "It's not happy." Samuel's heart ached. He didn't know how to fix this, how to make things right for her. "It's okay to feel that way," he said gently. "What happened to you? It wasn't fair, but we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. I promise." Lily nodded, but Samuel could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe him, not fully, and Samuel couldn't blame her. How could she trust in a system that had betrayed her so completely? As the investigation into Officer Simmons continued, it became clear that the police department wasn't going to go down without a fight. They had hired a team of high-powered attorneys to defend Simmons and protect the department's reputation. Chief Palmer, who had once seemed willing to cooperate, had grown more distant, avoiding public appearances and issuing carefully worded statements to the press. Samuel watched as the department dug in its heels, refusing to acknowledge the systemic issues that had led to the mistreatment of his daughter and others like her. It was frustrating beyond words. He had expected resistance, but the sheer stubbornness of the department left him feeling helpless. One evening, Samuel met with Alicia and a few local leaders to discuss the next steps in their strategy. Alicia laid out the facts, explaining that while they had made some progress, the department's refusal to admit fault was going to make the fight even harder. "They're circling the wagons," Alicia said, her tone grim. "They know that if Simmons goes down, it could expose a lot of other issues within the department. They're not just protecting him, they're protecting themselves." Samuel's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" "We keep pushing," Alicia replied. "We've got the community on our side, and we've got the evidence. We just have to stay focused." Samuel nodded, though the frustration inside him continued to build. It seemed like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. The weeks dragged on, and the pressure on Samuel and Tara only intensified. The lawsuit, the media attention, the strain on their marriage, it was all coming to a head. Tara, who had tried so hard to be strong, was reaching her breaking point. One evening, after a long day at work, Samuel came home to find Tara packing a suitcase. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. "Tara," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Tara didn't look up as she folded a shirt into the bag. "I need a break, Sam. I need some space." Samuel felt a surge of panic. "Tara, please. We can't do this now. We're so close." Tara shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. I can't keep doing this, Sam. I've tried to be strong for you, for Lily, but I'm falling apart. I need time to breathe." Samuel took a step toward her, his heart breaking. "Tara, I need you. Lily needs you. We can't get through this without you." Tara wiped her eyes, her voice shaking. "I'm not leaving for good, Sam. I just need a few days. I need to clear my head. I'll be back. I promise." Samuel stood frozen as Tara zipped the suitcase and walked out the door. His mind raced, but he knew there was nothing he could do to stop her. He had always been the one fighting, but now it felt like the fight was slipping out of his hands. After Tara left, the weight of everything hit Samuel harder than it ever had before. He had always prided himself on being strong, on keeping it together for his family. But now, with Tara gone and Lily still struggling, he felt like he was on the verge of breaking. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Samuel sat on the porch alone, staring up at the sky. The silence was deafening, and for the first time since the incident, he let himself cry. He cried for his daughter, for his marriage, for the town he had once believed in, but now felt betrayed by. He had always thought that fighting for justice would make things right, but now he wasn't so sure. The battle had taken so much from him, his peace, his family, his sense of hope, and he didn't know if it was worth it anymore. But as the tears flowed, Samuel realized something. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let the weight of it all crush him. For Lily's sake, for Tara's sake, for the town's sake, he had to keep fighting. Even if it felt like everything was falling apart, he had to believe that it would be worth it in the end. The following week was one of the hardest Samuel had ever endured. Without Tara by his side, the house felt hollow, and the emotional burden grew heavier. Lily was quiet, retreating even more into herself. Samuel felt the crushing pressure of being both father and protector, while fighting a legal battle that seemed never-ending. Then a ray of hope appeared. Alicia Rhodes called with news that the police department was being pressured into making a settlement offer, which could include Officer Simmons' permanent dismissal. The internal investigation was wrapping up, and there were rumblings of deep systemic changes. While nothing was final yet, Alicia believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough. Samuel took the call standing in his kitchen, his heart racing. "This could be it," Alicia said confidently. "The tide is turning. The department knows they're running out of options." For the first time in weeks, Samuel allowed himself to feel hopeful. He had been so focused on the pain and setbacks that he had almost forgotten what victory could look like. "Thank you, Alicia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for sticking with us through all of this." "This is only the beginning," Alicia replied. "We're not just fighting for Lily. We're fighting for every family that's ever been hurt by a system that's supposed to protect them." After the call, Samuel stood in the quiet of the house, taking in the weight of Alicia's words. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but the thought that real change was within reach made his resolve harden. It wasn't just about getting Simmons fired anymore. It was about setting a precedent, about building something that would last. In the days following Alicia's call, word spread quickly that the lawsuit was gaining traction. Bloomfield's residents, emboldened by Samuel's fight, came together to support his cause. A community meeting was organized at the local park, where families who had once stayed silent now found the courage to speak out. Samuel stood before the crowd, looking out at the familiar faces of friends and neighbors, all of whom had been touched by the events of the past months. Lily sat beside him, quieter than usual, but she held his hand tightly as he prepared to speak. "Thank you all for being here," Samuel began, his voice steady. "When this started, I thought it was just about my daughter, about one mistake that needed to be corrected. But now I see that this is about all of us. It's about ensuring that no child, no family, ever has to experience what we've been through." The crowd nodded in agreement, their faces filled with determination. Parents who had once been afraid to challenge authority were now standing shoulder to shoulder, united in their demand for accountability. Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger. "This isn't just about Officer Simmons. This is about changing the way our town operates, about making sure our police officers serve the people they are supposed to protect, not intimidate them. It's about building trust." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, and Samuel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had been fighting for so long, but now he knew he wasn't fighting alone. As the meeting continued, several families shared their stories of mistreatment at the hands of the police, and each story fueled the collective resolve to see justice done. A plan was made to hold a series of town forums where residents could directly voice their concerns to the local government and police department. Samuel watched as the community came together, his heart swelling with pride. It was clear now that Bloomfield was changing, and he had been a part of that transformation. One evening, a few days after the community meeting, Samuel heard the front door open. He looked up from his place at the kitchen table, surprised to see Tara standing in the doorway. She looked tired, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there when she left. "Tara," Samuel said quietly, standing up. Tara set her bag down and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. For a moment they stood in silence, holding each other in a way that felt like a reunion after a long separation. "I'm sorry I left," Tara whispered, her voice filled with emotion. I couldn't handle it all. I needed time." "I know," Samuel said softly, stroking her hair. "I understand. I've missed you." Tara pulled back slightly, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. "I missed you too. And Lily. How is she?" Tara asked, her voice cracking. "She's getting there," Samuel said, slowly. "But she's stronger than she realizes." Tara smiled, wiping her eyes. "I want to be here for her. For you. I'm ready now." Samuel felt a surge of relief. He had been carrying so much on his shoulders, and having Tara back beside him made him feel like he could finally breathe again. "I'm glad you're home," he said, pulling her into another embrace. As they stood together, the weight of the past few months began to lift, little by little. They were a family again, and that gave Samuel the strength to keep fighting. With Tara back by his side and the community rallying behind him, Samuel felt a renewed sense of determination as they entered the final stages of the lawsuit. The police department's internal investigation into Officer Simmons had revealed several instances of misconduct, and pressure was mounting for Chief Palmer to make a decision about his future with the force. One afternoon, Samuel and Alicia met with Chief Palmer and her legal team to discuss the next steps. The tension in the room was thick, but Samuel could sense that they were on the verge of a breakthrough. "We've reviewed the findings of the investigation," Chief Palmer began, her voice measured, "and we agree that Officer Simmons' conduct was unacceptable. As of today, he has been terminated from the police force." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. It was the news he had been waiting for. The news that his family, and the entire community, had been fighting for. But Chief Palmer wasn't finished. "Additionally," she continued, "the department will be implementing new policies regarding the treatment of minors and the use of force. We are also establishing a community oversight committee to ensure that our officers are held accountable for their actions." Samuel glanced at Alicia, who gave him a small nod of approval. It wasn't just a victory. It was the beginning of real, meaningful change. "Thank you, Chief Palmer," Alicia said, her tone professional. "We appreciate your willingness to work with us to create a safer community." Chief Palmer nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "This is just the first step. We have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust." Samuel stood, extending his hand to the chief. "I'm willing to work with you to make sure this never happens again." As they shook hands, Samuel felt a sense of closure. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the start of something new, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. The days after Officer Simmons's dismissal were filled with a sense of relief and cautious optimism. The lawsuit had brought about the changes Samuel had hoped for, and while there was still much work to be done, the victory felt real. One evening, Samuel, Tara, and Lily sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their quiet street. It was a rare moment of peace, and Samuel savored it, knowing how far they had come. Lily sat beside him, her sketchbook in her lap. She had started drawing again, her love for art slowly returning as the trauma of the past months began to fade. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Samuel asked, glancing at the colorful swirls on the page. Lily smiled, holding up the sketchbook to reveal a picture of a large sun shining over a field of flowers. "It's a new sun," she said simply. "A happy one." Samuel felt his chest tighten with emotion. "It's beautiful," he said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Just like you." Lily leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you think everything will be okay now, Daddy?" she asked softly. Samuel looked out at the horizon, the colors of the setting sun blending together in a peaceful glow. "I think we're going to be okay," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "It's a new beginning." As they sat together watching the last light of day fade into night, Samuel knew that they had weathered the storm, and while the fight for justice would continue, they had found their way back to each other. The sun shone brightly on the day of the community forum, a symbolic event marking the first step in rebuilding trust between Bloomfield's residents and the police department. Samuel stood at the entrance to the park, watching as families, children, and community members filtered in, their faces lit with a sense of cautious hope. For months, the town had been embroiled in conflict, but now they were coming together to create a better future. Lily stood beside him, holding her mother's hand. Though she was still shy around large groups, she had grown stronger in the months since Officer Simmons' dismissal. Her chalk had returned to the front porch, and her drawings once again filled the sidewalks around their home. In the center of the park, a large mural was being created by local artists and children. It was a vibrant display of flowers, birds, and a large, radiant sun, the same sun that Lily had drawn countless times before. It was a symbol of new beginnings, of the light that had returned after months of darkness. As the forum began, Chief Diane Palmer took the stage, her tone humble yet authoritative. The past few months had forced her to confront the deep-seated issues within her department, and she had come to recognize that real change required more than just firing one officer. It required rebuilding trust from the ground up. "We are here today to listen," Chief Palmer began, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "This is a new chapter for Bloomfield, and it starts with all of us, working together to create a community where everyone feels safe. I want to assure you that the police department is committed to making the necessary changes. But we can't do it alone. We need your voices, your ideas, your support." The crowd listened intently, their expressions a mixture of cautious optimism and lingering skepticism. But Samuel could see that something had shifted. The people of Bloomfield were ready to work together to ensure that what happened to Lily, and so many others, would never happen again. As Chief Palmer stepped down from the stage, Samuel was called up to speak. He took a deep breath, his heart swelling with pride and a renewed sense of purpose as he stood before the community. "I'm not here as your mayor today," Samuel began, his voice carrying across the park. "I'm here as a father, as someone who has seen firsthand the damage that can be done when trust between the police and the people they serve is broken. But I'm also here as someone who believes in the power of change. We have come a long way, but the work isn't finished." He paused, looking out at the faces of his friends, neighbors, and fellow parents. "This forum is just the beginning. We have a chance to build something better, to create a town where our children can feel safe, where they can play and draw and live without fear." Lily squeezed his hand, her wide eyes filled with admiration as she listened to her father's words. Samuel smiled down at her, feeling the bond between them grow even stronger in that moment. As the forum continued, residents lined up to share their thoughts, ask questions, and express their hopes for the future. Parents voiced their concerns about how officers interacted with children, while others spoke about the need for more transparency in the department's actions. The conversations were honest, sometimes difficult, but always constructive. Chief Palmer took notes, nodding thoughtfully as each speaker shared their perspective. It was clear that the department was committed to listening, and that gave Samuel hope. This wasn't just a performative gesture. It was the start of something real. At one point, a young boy, no older than 10, stepped up to the microphone. His voice trembled as he spoke, but his words were filled with the kind of courage that only children possess. "I used to be scared of the police," he admitted, "but I don't want to be scared anymore. I want to feel safe when I see them." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Chief Palmer smiled gently at the boy. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "We want you to feel safe too, and we're going to work hard to make sure that happens." Samuel watched the interaction, his heart swelling with pride for the town he had once feared was lost to fear and mistrust. Bloomfield was on the path to healing, and while the road ahead was still long, Samuel knew they were heading in the right direction. Later that afternoon, after the forum had ended, Samuel and his family stayed behind in the park. Lily wandered over to the mural, her fingers grazing the colorful shapes and symbols that had been drawn by the children of Bloomfield. She paused at the large sun in the center, smiling softly as the warm rays of the real sun bathed the park in golden light. Tara sat on a bench nearby, watching her daughter with a peaceful expression. "She's getting better," she said quietly, looking over at Samuel. "She is," Samuel agreed, sitting beside her. It's slow, but she's coming back to herself. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching as Lily picked up a piece of chalk and began adding her own touches to the mural. Samuel felt a deep sense of pride as he watched his daughter reclaim the joy she had once lost. Lily's strokes were gentle and deliberate, as if each line carried a piece of her heart. She drew flowers, birds, and finally, in the center of the mural, a giant sun with a wide, radiant smile. It was the same sun she had drawn on the sidewalk in front of their home all those months ago, the one that had sparked the chain of events leading to this moment. Samuel and Tara watched in awe as Lily stood back to admire her work, her face glowing with a quiet happiness. "Daddy," Lily called out, turning to face them, "I'm done." Samuel and Tara walked over, admiring the mural with fresh eyes. It was a beautiful representation of hope, of resilience, of a community coming together to heal. "It's perfect," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. Lily smiled, her eyes bright and free from the shadows that had once haunted her. "I'm happy," she said simply. "I think the sun is too." As the weeks passed, Bloomfield continued to change. The police department, under the guidance of the new Community Oversight Committee, began implementing the reforms that had been promised. Officers attended mandatory training on de-escalation techniques and bias, and the department began holding regular forums where residents could voice their concerns directly to the chief. Samuel, true to his word, stayed involved in the process, working closely with Chief Palmer to ensure that the changes were meaningful and lasting. It wasn't an easy road, and there were still moments of frustration and disagreement, but the progress was undeniable. The lawsuit had brought attention to the problems within Bloomfield's law enforcement, but it had also ignited a movement for reform that stretched far beyond one family's fight for justice. Samuel's role as mayor had become even more vital, as he worked to rebuild the community's trust and ensure that Bloomfield remained a safe, welcoming place for everyone. One evening, as Samuel, Tara, and Lily sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lily spoke up. "Daddy," she said softly, "do you think what happened to me will happen to someone else?" Samuel looked at her, his heart heavy but hopeful. "We've made sure that it won't," he said gently. "We've changed things, Lily, and we're going to keep making things better." Lily nodded, her face thoughtful. "I'm glad. I don't want anyone else to be scared." Samuel smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride in his daughter. "You're very brave, you know that?" Lily smiled back, her eyes sparkling in the fading light. "I learned from you." The sun set slowly over Bloomfield that evening, casting long shadows across the town that had endured so much. But as the last rays of light faded, there was a sense of renewal in the air, a feeling that the darkness had passed, and a new day was on the horizon. Samuel sat on the porch with Tara and Lily, watching the world settle into a peaceful stillness. For the first time in months, he felt a deep sense of calm, knowing that they had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. It wasn't just about the lawsuit. It wasn't just about Officer Simmons. It was about the future they had built together, the trust they had restored, and the community they had fought to protect. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Samuel leaned back in his chair, content in the knowledge that they had made a difference. They had changed the course of their town's history, and in doing so, they had created a safer, brighter future for their daughter, and for every child in Bloomfield. Lily snuggled into his side, her eyes fluttering closed as she whispered, "I love you, Daddy." Samuel kissed the top of her head, his heart full. "I love you too, sweetheart. Always." As the night deepened and the world grew quiet, Samuel closed his eyes, ready to embrace whatever tomorrow would bring. It was, after all, just the beginning.